Before we go anywhere today, just take a breath with me. It's not to fix anything, not to change anything, just to notice where you are. If you were taught to fear God, to fear being wrong, to fear your own thoughts, desires, or questions, I want you to know something right now. You're not broken. You were taught. And this episode isn't here to take anything away from you. It's here to let something soften. In reality, fear was a method, not a message. For a long time, I believed fear was part of spirituality. Fear of punishment, fear of separation, fear of being unworthy, fear of getting it wrong. And I was told that fear was reverence, that fear was respect, that fear was proof I was taking God seriously. The fear of God, as my dad always said. But here's what I've come to understand. Fear was never the message. It was the method. You see, fear works quickly. It creates obedience without intimacy. It controls behavior without requiring connection. And over time, fear became a tool, not because people were evil, but because systems learned it was effective. Love invites, fear commands. And when fear enters spirituality, something subtle happens. The soul stops expanding and starts bracing. So let's discuss what fear does to the body. Fear doesn't live only in belief. It lives in the body. A fearful body tightens its breath, contracts the chest, locks the jaw, and closes the throat. It shuts down the intuition. Science now confirms this. Chronic fear activates the sympathetic nervous system, keeping the body in survival mode. And a body in survival mode cannot access clarity, intuition, or higher perception. This matters. Because if your spirituality made you anxious, hypervigilant, ashamed of your own humanity, that wasn't holiness. That was physiology. A frightened nervous system can't hear truth clearly. It can only listen for danger. This brings us to the topic of when religion becomes a nervous system pattern. This is something we rarely talk about. Religion didn't just shape beliefs, it shaped bodies. It taught us how to hold ourselves, how to breathe, how to speak or not speak. Fear of punishment collapses the heart. Fear of being wrong tightens the throat. Fear of desire numbs the sacral. Fear of questioning disconnects intuition. Over time, faith became less about connection and more about compliance. Not because love disappeared, but because control replaced trust. And slowly, many of us learned to associate God not with safety, but with tension. So then we come face to face with the quiet lie we were told. There's a lie many of us inherited, that fear is guidance, that discomfort means you're being corrected, that anxiety means you're close to truth. But fear and truth don't feel the same in the body. Fear constricts, truth expands. Fear rushes, truth settles. Fear silences, truth clarifies. When I look at the life and teachings of Yeshua, I don't see fear as the entry point. He calmed people before he taught them. He restored bodies before correcting beliefs. He never coerced love. Love was always the teacher. Fear was never the doorway. Now, maybe you're wondering what freedom actually feels like. Well, freedom doesn't feel rebellious. That one surprised me. I thought freedom would feel loud, defiant, explosive. But real freedom feels peaceful. The breath drops lower, the shoulders soften, the heart opens without effort. Curiosity replaces obedience, and discernment replaces fear. You stop asking, what am I allowed to believe? And you start asking, what feels true in my body? Freedom isn't the absence of devotion, it's devotion without terror. And Now we have the inherited God versus the living source. There's something important to name here. Most of us were never introduced to God. Let that one sink in. We were introduced to a description of God, someone else's description, handed down through centuries, shaped by politics, filtered through power, translated by people who had their own fears, their own agendas, their own very human limitations. And we received that description as children, before we had the language to question it, before we had the life experience to test it, before we had any frame of reference for what was theology and what was control. So we built our entire inner world around a version of a God that was never fully true, a God who kept score, a God who withheld love based on behavior, a God who needed appeasement, a God whose acceptance had conditions attached. But here's what the mystics knew. Here's what the Gnostic texts preserved. Here's what Yeshua himself kept trying to point people back to. Source is not watching from a distance, deciding who is worthy. Source is the very fabric of what you are made of. It is not above you. It is not outside of you. It is not withholding itself until you get it right. It is the intelligence that beats your heart without your permission. It's the wisdom that heals a wound without your instruction. The presence that has been breathing you since before you even had a name. That source, the real one, has never required your fear. It has never needed your smallness to feel large. It has never asked you to make yourself less in order to be loved. The inherited God demanded devotion through terror. The living source simply asks you to remember what you already are. There is a world of difference between those two invitations. One asks you to perform. The other asks you to come home. And now there's the reality of having permission to grieve what you were given. Now, before we move forward, I just want to pause here and acknowledge something that is, that we don't talk about enough, especially in spiritual places. Leaving fear-based faith is not just liberating, it's also a loss. And that loss deserves to be honored. Because many of you were genuinely devoted. You weren't naive, you weren't weak, you weren't foolish for believing what you were taught. You were sincere. You prayed with your whole heart. You showed up. You tried. You gave everything you had to a version of a God you were told was the only one. I know that devotion. I lived it. I spent years on my knees praying to be different, praying to be fixed, asking God to take away the part of me that I had been told made me unworthy of love. And I was so sincere in those prayers, so faithful, so desperate to be acceptable to a God who I thought, who I now understand, never saw me as unacceptable to begin with. That young man deserved better theology, and so did you. So if there is grief sitting in your chest right now, grief for the years spent in fear, grief for the version of yourself that you suppressed in order to stay acceptable, grief for the community you lost when you started asking questions, grief for the faith you once had that no longer fits the person that you're becoming. Let it be there. Don't rush past it. Don't spiritually bypass it with a random reframe. Just let yourself feel the tenderness of it. Because here's what I've learned. Grief is not the opposite of faith. Grief is what happens when love finally gets honest. You are not falling away from God by letting go of fear. You are falling toward the truest version of Source you have ever been close enough to feel. And that's not abandonment. That is reclamation. So here's a soft initiation for you. If fear still lives somewhere inside you, don't fight it. Don't shame it. Thank it for trying to protect you. And then gently remind it. Love doesn't need threats. Truth doesn't need fear. And God doesn't need you small. If love is real, it won't scare you into staying. It will invite you to rest. I can tell you from the other side of that fear, and I say other side not because I've arrived somewhere perfect, but because I've arrived somewhere where I can finally just breathe. Faith feels different now. It doesn't feel like bracing. It feels like belonging. It doesn't feel like performance. It feels like presence. It doesn't feel like I'm one wrong thought away from losing everything. It feels like I was never in danger of losing what was always mine to begin with. And I want that for you. Not my version of it, obviously, yours. The specific shape of peace that only your nervous system knows how to carry. The particular frequency of faith that only your soul was built to be able to hold. Because that is what this whole series is about. Not trading one set of rules for another. Not replacing one authority with a different one. But learning, slowly, gently, one breath at a time, to trust the living source that has been inside you all along. This is reclamation. And you are doing it beautifully. And I love you for that. I don't have all the answers. I'm learning this as I go. And if you want to join in, hit subscribe and follow along. We would love to have you in the community and see how it grows. There's a lot to learn. And I'm diving in headfirst. Join me.